Hello, everyone, and welcome to this next episode of the Akkad and Koka Report. I'm Michel Akkad in San Francisco, and I'll be hosting this episode by myself as my co-host Anish Koka, unfortunately, cannot be with us today. Now, no term or concept commands more respect than the term evidence-based. Since its introduction in the late 1980s or early 1990s, the idea that medicine should be evidence-based has become so firmly entrenched in academia and in the mind of the public at large that any criticism of evidence-based principles are usually met with utter disbelief, if not scorn. In recent years, however, the grip of the evidence-based medicine dogma seems to have loosened a bit, and contrarian views are increasingly being expressed and heard in academic journals. Our guest today is, in my opinion, one of the earliest, most thoughtful, and most articulate academic critic of EBM. Mark Tonelli is professor of critical care medicine at the University of Washington. He holds a BA in philosophy from the University of Colorado, and he also obtained his medical doctorate from the University of Colorado in Denver. He holds a master's in medical ethics and is the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on various aspects of medical science and medical philosophy. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you. And I want to tell the audience, at the outset here, we're going to spend maybe, half of the episode to talk about your critique of EBM, the limits of evidence-based medicine. And then we also want to talk about what you offer as because we don't want to leave the public, on board without, criticizing and demolishing EBM. And then we have nothing to go by, how can we know anything? So we're going to talk about your alternative. You're very, very thoughtful and good alternative to EBM. But when we talk about the limits of EBM, we're not going to do justice to your critique. So I'm going to link in the show notes to a Grand Rounds talk that you gave that is on YouTube that is absolutely excellent because it's very clear, very systematic. You go point by point. You're very charitable, I think, to the EBM crowd. And so I link to that on the show notes so people can go to that if they need, to hear you be more explicit on certain points. And I'll link to, the papers that you've written over the years, the key papers that where you develop these ideas. But let's get started and tell us, you've rehearsed this before. Tell us what's the problem with EBM. Where do we start? How do we...
Sure. I've been interested in the limits of evidence-based medicine for over 20 years, and I think part of that just is a contrarian streak, perhaps, that it started. But it's over time, I think there are certainly many other folks who have pointed out the limitations of evidence-based medicine. Like you said, it's very hard. When somebody says, should medicine be evidence-based, it's very hard to disagree. It's a quite well-branded product, evidence-based medicine.
Right, because the alternative seems to be, the alternative is alternative medicine or voodoo medicine or something, completely crazy, right?
Right.
After evidence-based medicine, then you're a lunatic who believes in magnets and Reiki.
Right. Or, from a philosophical standpoint, right? If you don't believe in evidence, then you're certainly not being scientific, and you're probably not being rational. And so to push back against something termed evidence-based medicine seems irrational. But like so many things, the devil's in the details. And so I think for me, what first stood out about evidence-based medicine is a very narrow definition of evidence. So when in the early days of evidence-based medicine and continuing through to this day, when people say, what does the evidence show, they generally are talking very specifically about clinical research and particularly quantitative clinical research. And you have to be careful if you're going to criticize evidence-based medicine. Immediately, proponents of evidence-based medicine are going to say that's a straw man. That's not what evidence-based medicine says. But as we go, further into this conversation, I think it's very clear that that's what evidence-based medicine writes about. That's what they focus on. And while there may be there are many thoughtful proponents of evidence-based medicine who will say other things besides clinical research matter, and we'll talk about what those things are: pathophysiologic reasoning, clinician experience. Certainly the input from goals and values of individual patients. They'll say that those things matter, but they don't spend any other time talking about them.
Right. In fact, I mean, they rank. They have a hierarchy of what.
Yeah, there are multiple hierarchies of
Okay.
evidence, but they all start with generally quantitative clinical research at the very top.
Right.
And things that we'll spend more time talking about, I hope, in terms of individual clinician experience, pathophysiologic reasoning or mechanistic reasoning. Those things are always at the very bottom. There are well over 100 of these types of hierarchies, but they all have that same general focus, and with the idea that if we're going to talk about evidence-based medicine, we want to talk about best evidence, and best evidence always is clinical research. And I think clinicians inherently, if you stop and you think about that, in making clinical decisions and reaching clinical judgments, that's not always the case, right? The major problem with that notion from a philosophical standpoint is that the general information can only give you provide sort of limited guidance in making decisions about particulars. So when it comes down to making decisions about individual patients, it's just a philosophical truism that general information, the type that's perhaps generated by good clinical research, and I do want to talk about, I'm not trying to dismiss clinical research, it's unimportant, it's very valuable, right? So that's the other thing that happens is you're attacking a straw man, or how can you dismiss clinical research as important? I'm not dismissing it as important. I'm just saying it's not prescriptive, and it's not in and of itself sufficient to reach decisions about.
Right. And in fact, if it were prescriptive, we would be automatically making decisions, on the basis of clinical research. I mean, if a clinical trial, for example, is available and it gives an answer, whatever that answer might be, then that would be, we should apply this to everybody, irrespective, if you follow the hierarchy. And we don't do that. We don't do that. And people who write guidelines or who are proponents of evidence-based medicine, admit that we shouldn't do that, right?
Well, there is that.
There's a contradiction. It seems to be, or at least a tension.
So sometimes there's that notion that, I think if you read the literature of evidence-based medicine, there's often implicit or an explicit sort of idea that you are going to go to look at general information and apply that somehow directly, right? And I think you're right that thoughtful proponents of evidence-based medicine say, no, that's not the case. It's not prescriptive. Patients are individuals. But the original descriptions of evidence-based medicine, where you use the patient basically to generate a question that was answerable with an appeal to clinical research, and then somehow you just applied that back to the patient. Now, other descriptions of evidence-based medicine talk about, okay, you go to the literature, you look at the evidence, the clinical research, and then when you apply that back to the patient, you need to integrate that with other types of knowledge or information or the patient goals and values. But again, in evidence-based medicine, that integration part, there's no discussion of that whatsoever. Mm-hmm. It just integrate here. There's just this idea that we all somehow know how to do that. But if you're really a proponent of evidence-based medicine and you think that there's best evidence and that in some ways determines what is the best care for individual patients, you have to be able to describe that. And there is essentially no description of that in the literature of evidence-based medicine. And that's a big part of what, I'm focused on. I think that, as in your introduction, when you said we're going to talk a little bit about the limits of evidence-based medicine and an alternative, I think that there are a couple ways to look at the case-based reasoning that I'm a proponent of. One is to say it's an alternative to evidence-based medicine, and that's how I originally have advanced it. But I think the other way to look at it is to just say, well, maybe we should just look at this integrate part. All right, so keep the general construct of evidence-based medicine and say, all right, clinical research it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's not prescriptive. So how do we get from the clinical research to the individual patient? A problem that's been here since Aristotle. How do we get to the general, to the particular? How do we integrate other knowledge? And then, so I think a lot of what I'm very interested in is to say, okay, so what is the other knowledge that gets integrated in that place? What are the rules for that? And I think, as you've already alluded, the hierarchy of evidence is philosophically and clinically untenable. So if that's not a rule, then what are there rules for integrating other forms of knowledge into clinical decision making, and how should that look, and how should that be adjudicated? So I think it's I do think that there are many thoughtful proponents of evidence-based medicine who recognize that clinical research is not directly applicable to individual patients,
Right.
but they just haven't told us. They haven't been very helpful in going beyond that.
Okay, well, let's open that new chapter of what you call case-based reasoning, and how you view this process of integration, because I think essentially that's what it is, right?
Yeah, so I think if we start with the recognition that clinical research is helpful in making decisions about individual patients, but not prescriptive and not sufficient, then the next question is to say, well, what other types of knowledge, what other types of information are important for that? Both are legitimate in medical practice, and then we'll talk about how they, how do you negotiate between them. As you suggested, right? We're not talking about voodoo medicine. We're not talking about reading tea leaves. There are things that I think from a medical and scientific standpoint, we all will say are, you can't bring into the clinical decision, but there are plenty of things we do, right? As clinicians. One is our experience. And I think early critics of evidence-based medicine rightly pointed out that, wait, this really seems dismissive of clinical experience, of the experience of individual practitioners. That was called unsystematic clinical experience. It was clearly de-emphasized and devalued.
Right. I think there's a confusion between, when people are critical of evidence-based medicine, is people who have these opinions, but we all distinguish somebody with a good expert from somebody who may have an authoritative opinion and who's bad, right? I mean, there are people that I think maybe in academia were placed in position of power and would sort of impose their views on everybody on the basis of, but that's different from, again, recognizing someone has a lot of experience in something and who is, wise and thoughtful and whose opinion matters. And when we criticize the evidence-based medicine or the authoritarian, I think that we're recognizing at the same time that we can distinguish between a good expert from a bad expert.
Yeah. And I do think that, most of these other forms of knowledge and information that we're going to talk about, were dismissed, at least initially, by evidence-based medicine for the reasons you say, right? You can't trust authority. And there are multiple examples, right, where we thought this was the best therapy, and then clinical research demonstrates it is not. And you're absolutely right that an appeal to authority for authority's sake is not the way anybody should view the optimal practice of medicine. But then there is this problem of sort of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because there are clearly things we learn in taking care of patients that are important for taking care of the next patient, right? This is why you don't go to the medical librarian when you want to make a medical decision, right? The medical librarian has access to all of the clinical research available in the world and probably can sort through it better than we can, but they don't have his experience taking care of patients. And so that recognition that our individual clinical experience is important and is additive. And when you take care of a lot of patients with the same disease, you develop an expertise, right? And that expertise can be valuable. Is it always correct? Of course not. And no form of knowledge is, including clinical research, right? There are plenty of clinical studies, randomized controlled trials that are later demonstrated to be wrong, and there are meta-analyses of the same issue that come to different conclusions. So no form of knowledge is going to be infallible. So I think that notion of our clinical experience is important. And again, you will see thoughtful proponents of evidence-based medicine acknowledge that, and the definition of probably the most popular definition of evidence-based medicine, Sackett and others sort of said, I won't know the direct quote, I probably should because I've said it enough times, but it's, it's the ability to look at, best evidence, but incorporate that with clinical experience.
Right. The judicious, conscientious,
and explicit.
Explicit,
Yes.
right, right.
But again, there's that acknowledgement that clinical experience matters, but then there's no further discussion. Okay. And I'm sure you've come across this, and I think most of the listeners you have who are clinicians, particularly if they work in anywhere close to an academic environment, but even outside of the academics, will say at some point where somebody, you make a clinical judgment, you express an opinion, and then people will, sort of push back and say, well, where's the evidence for that? And you say, well, in my experience, and that's often considered, that in my experience is considered a inadequate justification for even, sometimes even the most reasonable conclusions. I think in my mind, EBM can't say, yes, clinical experience matters, but then not tell us how it.
Right, right. So Mark, you have, I think you've is it 5 different categories of knowledge that you sort of make explicit? I mean, it may not be all comprehensive, but can you walk us through that? And
so I think, getting to that point, of saying, okay, so clinical research is important, but it's not sufficient. So what else is, what other types of knowledge or information are legitimate to bring into clinical judgment? And I think, so clinical experience, your, individual clinician clinical experience, or the expert opinion of people, like you said, who you can trust and where there's an ability to adjudicate the knowledge that they've gained in terms of taking care of patients. So that's one. The other is pathophysiologic reasoning or mechanistic reasoning, right? So we all went to medical school for a long time. We spent a couple of years trying to understand things like physiology and biochemistry. And we often still reason in clinical situations from an understanding of mechanisms, basic biological, physiologic mechanisms. And again, evidence-based medicine is quick to point out that there are, multiple times where that has led us astray, right? And so the CAST trial, which I'm sure you're quite familiar with as a cardiologist, right? I believe the CAST trial, which was the arrhythmia suppression trial, has probably been cited more by proponents of evidence-based medicine than by the cardiology literature,
Right.
But this idea of, here's where mechanistic reasoning may lead us astray. And absolutely, there are times when mechanistic reasoning will lead us astray. People love to go back to historical examples of bleeding and purging, but even today, mechanism can lead us astray. Our understanding can be incomplete. But yet we live in this era now, this kind of precision medicine era, where our understanding of mechanism is getting better and better. And where mechanism is clearly impacting, drug development, and yet at the same time, we're completely dismissive of it.
Correct. And in fact, I mean, it's almost this criticism of mechanistic reasoning is almost anecdotal, right? It's not, because
it's very anecdotal.
You have the numerator is just the CAST trial, or maybe a few examples. The denominator is a huge number of mechanistically based practices that we all think are very good.
Absolutely, you hit that one exactly right. Which I think the argument. So primarily, the argument against mechanistic reason has been very anecdotal. And here's a list of one of the philosophy of evidence-based medicine book that's basically, here's 18 examples, right? And you're like, well, yeah, those are, like you said, that's anecdotal evidence, right? And I think there actually is a interesting and very strong push from the philosophy of medicine side. It has yet to, I think, necessarily permeate clinical medicine, of kind of rehabilitating mechanistic reasoning. There is a group out of England, Evidence-Based Medicine Plus. So they put evidence-based medicine in their name, but what they're really focused on is, getting mechanistic reasoning back into clinical decision making. Their primarily focused on these guideline development type things. So like you pointed out, there's a difference between guideline development and clinical practice. But the idea of maybe we should bring mechanistic understanding in explicitly into guideline development, where right now it's obviously completely rejected, right? Mm-hmm. It's not seen as valuable. So mechanistic reasoning, pathophysiologic reasoning is another important bit of information. The other thing is obviously the goals, values, experiences of the patients we take care of, what makes them individuals, right? We can't individualize care if you don't understand the individual in front of you. And clearly the most obvious reason why clinical research is not prescriptive is that you have an individual in front of you who may have very different goals, values, interpretations of the burdens or costs of the therapies. That means you have to understand that individual in order to figure out what
decision to
what are the most important things that enter into that decision making, right? So even a study that shows that somebody, the study that's fairly convincing that if you want to increase your quantity of life, you're going to do intervention A, and there are people who don't want to introduce maximize their quantity of life. They're more focused on their quality of life, and you're going to need to spend time to figure that out. So patient goals and values, and then there's just the contextual features of where we all practice, what gets paid for, religious issues, cultural issues. We don't do healthcare in a vacuum, so those contextual features also have to enter. So I think all of those types of knowledge and information that this shouldn't be surprising to clinicians. You can easily reflect that all of those enter into different clinical judgments.
On this last one, the question of context, one to me is a very underappreciated one is. If the guideline, if the evidence, if the clinical research calls for a certain intervention, say an angioplasty or surgery to be performed, then the question becomes the quality of the surgeon performing that, right? Mm-hmm. That surgery. I mean, if the evidence says that you need to repair the valve instead of replace it, blah blah blah. Well, who do you have around you to?
Can they actually do that?
Actually do that, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and this is, and I think, as a crucial part of interpreting, moving clinical research into clinical practice, right? I mean, in the context of almost all clinical research, there are more and more pragmatic studies being done, and that's probably good. But for the most part, right, the context of the clinical research is extremely different than the context in which we practice, just by its very nature. So there's nothing that can easily be translated or adopted. I always think it's interesting. There's a in the evidence-based medicine world, there are often clinical research projects that show how slow the adoption of a particular intervention was, right? And there's this frustration of, look how slow this is. And yet, there are times when that's been a very good idea with, drugs or interventions. In my business in critical care, I think of tight glucose control or activated protein C for sepsis, both of which there were early studies and people were pushing hard to do those things in all ICUs. And it turns out neither one of them is beneficial, and they're probably both harmful. And so, this idea that we need to adopt these things quicker clearly doesn't recognize the contextual features. Right. And something that works in one environment, this is very true about healthcare policy, but something that works in one environment is not going to work in another environment. And there are ways to figure that out ahead of time, maybe, or at least think about that, right? And those are things like experience and pathophysiologic reasoning and understanding context, or understanding your patient population, that they weren't the same group that was enrolled in this study because they differ in terms of their goals, their values, their experience with an illness. So all of those things have to enter into a clinical judgment and a clinical decision or a clinical recommendation. And so then the question is, well, okay, if we're going to acknowledge that, and
how do you do that? All right.
And again, I think, thoughtful proponents of evidence-based medicine may acknowledge that. And I think the first thing you have to do is chuck the hierarchy, right?
Right.
Because it doesn't make sense.
Right. So you have all these categories of knowledge, and they're not, there's not one that's going to trump the others.
Exactly. They differ in kind. They don't differ in degree. The idea that, clinical research belongs at the top for some reason, usually it's because of the notion that it's less biased in its acquisition, but even that's not demonstrably true.
Right. Right.
But the idea that, so why is it that if I have a vast amount of experience in terms of caring for a particular illness, and I have an individual where I would do one thing, a lousy, poorly controlled, but published clinical research result is supposed to be higher level evidence, better evidence. It's maybe the best evidence, compared to my clinical experience and pathophysiologic reasoning. Why should that be, right? And there is no, from a philosophical standpoint, it's completely untenable. And interestingly, I think in the philosophy of medicine, the whole idea of a hierarchy of evidence has been completely and thoroughly trashed.
Mm-hmm.
But that has not come, that has not yet permeated clinical medicine, and this hierarchy keeps showing up on people's slide sets and
that pyramid that
pyramid.
It's kind of a agnostic. The Illuminati have the pyramid symbol as well. You have the eye at the top.
At the top, it's always some form of, it's a meta-analysis or
right.
a systematic review or a Cochrane report. Yeah, so. That makes no sense, and it makes no sense from a clinical standpoint. It makes no sense from a philosophical epistemic standpoint. That these are different kinds of knowledge. They have different types of value. They have strengths and weaknesses. None of them is infallible. None of them is particularly more useful or less useful overall. But different clinical scenarios will really your job as a clinician is to say, well, which of these types of knowledge, which of these are the most guiding in this particular case, right? And so it ends up not being the problem with integration or the problem with case-based reasoning is there are not a lot of firm rules. You can't just go, okay, published clinical research always wins. It always trumps even the best clinical experience or the most careful pathophysiologic reasoning. That would be I argue that's the practice of bad medicine. There are proponents of evidence-based medicine who argue that's rubbish EBM. I think we agree on that point. So then the question is, how do you adjudicate these types of things?
Okay, well, so how do you become a good clinician and pick, decide how you're gonna, what weight you're gonna give to these different categories of knowledge, and apply them to a particular patient.
Yeah, and so I think that's
so if there's no rule, and it's good to acknowledge that. I mean, that's the starting point. But at the same time, there are people who do it better than others, right?
Yes.
And I think we need to recognize that. And again, not everybody will agree who's a good doctor, who's not a good doctor, but it's not completely random, right? It's not completely random.
No, I agree. And you can say there aren't a lot of necessarily rules, but there is a method. And the way of adjudicating this, and which will be unsatisfying to some people, is that it's professionally adjudicated because, as you say, most clinicians will recognize who's a good clinician, and it doesn't take us long. And I'm in the business of medical education, and I can tell relatively quickly in working with trainees who are good clinicians and who need more help with their clinical reasoning skills, right? And so I think that the key is to say, first thing we have to do is acknowledge that all of these different types of knowledge and information are important and are valuable. And you can actually, in a clinical decision, the difficult clinical decision, go through them like, systematically, right? And go through and say, well, what does the clinical research tell us? Okay, we've done that. We've looked at a meta-analysis, systematic review. What do we know from experience? The experts who take care of this illness at this institution, my own, personal clinical experience. How do we reason about this pathophysiologically? Is there something about this individual patient, pathophysiologically or or based on my experience. I think this is an interesting place where the whole idea of intuition comes to play. Your experience is necessary to develop a clinical intuition. I don't want to spend too much time there because that's a really difficult and fraught area.
Yes, but very interesting, and I think clinical psychology is increasingly recognizing the value of intuition. And
yes,
and you're familiar with the debate between Kahneman and Klein and that sort of thing.
Yes, right. And I think, and also within medical education, there's a guy named Jeff Norman at University of Toronto who's done really quite interesting work looking at the idea of intuition and pattern recognition and the value of it, and that is how experts in medicine make their decisions. They don't go through some hypothetico-deductive model, in terms of differential diagnosis. I know what that is, right? And so I do think so recognizing those things are valuable, and then looking at the patient in front of you and really asking, is there something about this patient that's different? Either it's their goals, their values, what their experiences, what they're aiming for, or physiologically, or based on my intuition. It tells me that the sort of idea of the clinical research that people might invoke in this case really doesn't apply, or it does. Right. I think either way, you need to examine those issues. You can't just assume, right, that the guidelines always apply, or that the clinical research always applies. And so you can do that, and you can do that explicitly, right? Mm-hmm. And even if you're relying on intuition, you can be explicit about your reliance on intuition. Or if you're relying on experience, you can be explicit about relying on that, and then and talking about the contextual features that you're in, why you may be limited or perhaps more prone. Some of the contextual issues, right, are issues of bias, right, that might make us more inclined to intervene than we should be. So the process is actually going through those and then seeing where you weight them.
So that sounds very sound to me. But I can imagine we live in an era where medicine is paid for or rewarded or regulated by third parties, and they want to make sure that whatever doctors do is objectively good. Mm-hmm. You're not giving them anything very easy by which they can decide, whether you're practicing wisely or not. You alluded to professional prerogative, right, to make these decisions.
Yes.
And I agree with you. But the problem is that the bureaucrats, the regulators, or the academics in charge of the quality of medical care in the country are going to say, well, we can't give too much autonomy because what if they do the wrong thing? And how do we know? And that sort of thing. It's almost that's a contextual hurdle for what you're proposing.
Yes, very much so, and I certainly recognize that, right? So there's this idea that, and I think will be the way to get around this challenge is to say, as clinicians, we shouldn't individualize care, right? So we should treat each example of X in exactly the same way. And if somebody really wants to decrease variability in practice, and you want to assure that everybody is treated the same way, and you want to be able to objectively measure those types of behaviors, then that's what would have to happen, right? If we want, as a profession, to abandon the idea that we take care of try to do what's best for individual patients, we can solve that problem. But as long as we believe that we should continue to care for patients as individuals and treat each patient as an individual, then there's going to be variability.
Right.
And then how do you, there's this idea that there's a right amount of variability, but nobody knows what it is. There's clearly some variability that would be inappropriate. And I think that there are some aspects of clinical research that can be very important, like that often it's things like we shouldn't do this as a matter of routine, right? Mm-hmm. So we just, I don't know if I get all my medical information, or at least initially I get it from NPR and the New York Times. And I was driving in this morning listening to a story about aspirin in healthy older adults, right? And it sounded like a good study, and it suggested that maybe a baby aspirin a day is not helpful in older adults. And so that seems like something that, is actionable, where you could say, yeah, not saying that there's nobody who benefits from aspirin, because as you know, there are, but we're just not going to do it as a matter of routine. I get that. But when it comes down to making these much more difficult decisions, and clinical decisions about, what medication to treat an individual patient with, how closely to follow them, whether or not they get surgery, right, versus medical management, all these much more difficult decisions, if we're going to individualize them, then we're going to have to expect some variability. There is one bit of, like, one of my favorite papers to cite. There was a paper a few years back in the Annals by a gentleman named Purcell, P-E-R-S-E-L-L, and I don't have the citation, but I can send it to you, that I love, because he looked at a healthcare institution where everybody was supposed to be following guidelines, and those were measured. Not surprisingly, outcomes were measured, but the physicians had the option to, if they weren't going to follow a guideline, to enter in to free text why they weren't following the guideline.
Okay.
And then it was adjudicated. It has to be adjudicated by clinicians, but those were adjudicated by clinicians, and something like 93% of those exceptions were considered medically appropriate, right? So there's at least some evidence, if we're getting back to evidence, that the clinicians know how to do this, and that they're actually good at doing this. And there are things, some of these were really, you don't do colon cancer screening in somebody with metastatic prostate cancer. That just doesn't make sense.
And so I think one of the problem is that we've in this, I mean, it's been going on for decades, but then with this focus on quantifying what's the good, medicine has been reduced. The quality of medicine has been reduced to outcomes, right? But we know that outcomes cannot be the full answer. It cannot be the full answer. It might be an answer if you take a population. You might say, well, the outcomes. In general, but when you're taking care of an individual, you're not going to be judged on what's going to happen to that individual, because really, I mean, we all realize that our ability to control lives and the world and outcomes is very, very limited. I mean, it would be grandiose if we thought otherwise, and so what's missing here also, in the background is sort of an explicit understanding of what health is and what it's about. I mean, if it's not about outcomes, what is it about? And again, I don't want to open that can of worms here, but that seems to be, to me, part of the problem is that medicine has been reduced, and it's a long-standing problem. I mean, it's decades. I mean, it's sort of almost since the 19th century. This idea that it's a very explicit sort of scientific objective. I mean, it has an objective dimension, through mechanisms and whatnot, and certainly. But at the same time, I mean, health is something that goes beyond that. And then the other thing I wanted to say, that what you were just saying calls to mind, at least to me, that sure, we cannot, we can't have rules, with your approach and so forth, but we recognize, who the good doctors are, who the wise doctors are. So they need some autonomy. But what can keep their autonomy in check, and so we don't write, doctors a blank check, is competition. Is allow doctors and patients to some extent, because patients end up selecting doctors and trusting certain kinds of doctors. And we need that to play out, so that the good ones over time gets sort of rewarded, in a natural process. Either they get rewarded from within the professional community, by certain doctors, or by the patients or whatever. And perhaps at the end of the day, there'll be sort of different schools of medicine that sort of compete with one another. But competition to me is one way that you allow the good decisions to percolate and bubble up, as opposed to, rule-based. Which we know is untenable, because there are no rules, because we know these categories of knowledge are all fallible. So there's no possible rules. So there has to be a certain amount of freedom, and there's very little freedom in modern healthcare systems. in fact, it's pretty much the opposite. It's more and more going away from freedom for patients to choose their doctors, or from doctors to do what they think is right. So there has to be some competition, and perhaps, and also some accountability, which also there's less and less of that. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So yeah, a couple, just an observation. I agree. It seems like healthcare is becoming more and more constrained. It is interesting from a patient perspective. Patients, generally don't care why they get better. They don't really care about the evidence. They just care about getting better. One needs to be careful. I think what we don't want to get to the point where we ignore outcomes and we're just interested in patient satisfaction, because you can
right.
It's easy. Sometimes it's easy to convince a patient that you're kind, gentle, thoughtful, but you may not be a very good clinician. So I agree. Even the assessment of what does it take to be a good, what are the best outcomes, right? Because there is some kind of combination between maybe objective outcomes, but also is the patient satisfied? Are they regaining agency? Are they able to do what they want with their life? Those are issues that are much harder to you can't measure those very well.
Right.
And so then people if you can't measure it, then people tend to dismiss it as important. But clearly, patients don't dismiss it as important. And I mean, to your point on competition, I think it does say something that the alternative medicine world does so well in the United States, right? The amount of money people are willing to pay out of pocket. What is it that they're getting from that that they're not getting from the allopathic world, right? We should figure that out.
Right. That's very true. And obviously, we think that it's not outcomes, it's not hard outcomes, better hard outcomes.
No, I think it's often the fact that patients recognize that they're being treated as individuals.
Correct.
And that what they have to say matters. And if you as we start looking at patients as examples of something, and we apply, the idea that we're going to apply a guideline to them in some prescriptive fashion, patients pick that up pretty quickly, that they're not being treated as individuals. And so I think I for one was not advocating when I suggested it's a way to solve the problem, that we stop treating patients as individuals. I think that's a key element of medical practice.
Right, absolutely. But I want to say a little bit about that, because now the answer that we seem to be hearing from the EBM world is that the nods to patient individuality is providing them with a menu of choices and asking them what they want. Shared decision making.
Yeah.
You say, here's the evidence, and here's the pluses and the minuses and the probability and the this and that. Pick your choice. And I'm just going to say that. I mean, if we start the discussion, it could.
That's another whole discussion.
It's another whole discussion.
I mean, as you recognize, it's another well-branded. Who could be against shared decision making.
Right.
It's very well branded, but at the same time, there is a tremendous amount there. And I think you and I would clearly disagree that the role of the clinician in that setting is simply to set out options and to stand back and let patients make otherwise unfettered decisions about what's the best option. That is an abrogation of professional responsibility. But I think we both recognize that's another discussion. Yeah.
Amen. So, Mark, what's for you? What's the next step? What do you say? I mean, we need to educate one another, and is that what sort of spread the word, make sure that I think what you're saying is very, very important and cogent, and people have, I think by now, have some sense that the EBM narrative is missing sort of some,
yes.
But they don't know what to replace it with. And I think you're beginning or you're to a large extent filling in the blanks. And so what do? We just spread the word. What's your experience in publishing your ideas and your thoughts?
Well, I think it is something that I just spent the last academic year in Cambridge actually doing philosophy of medicine, which was a fantastic experience, and trying to actually get and got a book started on case-based reasoning to try to flesh these ideas out more cogently and in a more hopefully convincing fashion. I think that you're right to recognize that that there's a general sense, I agree with you, there's a general sense among clinicians, among pretty much all thoughtful clinicians, that there's something about the evidence-based medicine, movement and argument that it lacks something, that the early promises proved hard to keep, and that there's more to clinical practice than clinical research, even excellent clinical research. And so, yeah, for me, it's trying to, give people the language to sort of understand what the problem is. I look at it in a very philosophical standpoint because that's just my approach. I feel like as a clinician, I need to be able to couch it in more clinical terms. But at its core, it is a philosophical epistemic problem. I think so recognizing that, then sometimes it is a matter of giving clinicians the language to understand the problem, and a basic, allowing people to explore what those options may be. So yeah, it's a challenge. I love working, within medical education, but doing it, trying to get these things across one trainee at a time is probably not particularly efficient.
Right. I'm going to do my part to try to spread the word here. And so I'll have really, as I said, your talk, your Grand Rounds talk on the limits of evidence-based medicine, linked, your major papers, including the one called The Philosophical Limits of Evidence-Based Medicine, which is very comprehensive and very good, and recent work where you developed this idea of case-based reasoning. And Mark, thank you very, very much for spending this time. And I think we'll have you back because there's a lot more to explore.
Thanks for your interest in it. And certainly would welcome the opportunity to come back, and maybe we'll, given your recent focus on shared decision-making, we'll spend some time talking about that too.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mark. Take care.
Thank you.